Hello and welcome everybody to HWISE-NOW. We're really pleased that the panelists have been able to join us today, as well as our visitors. Since 2020, we have convened about 15 of these episodes as a means to keep connected during COVID. We've really found that it's been a great way to continue to exchange ideas, continue our conversations around questions of water and security with others. And so we've continued this moving forward. For new people who are joining us today who may not be directly involved in HWISE, I'll introduce myself. I'm Wendy Jepson. I'm a geographer, university professor at Texas A&M University. I have several hats, one as associate director for the Texas Water Resources Institute, and I also lead the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Research Coordination Network. And it's a collaboration that's been ongoing for many years and currently has financial support of the National Science Foundation. So HWISE is our sort of acronym, is a network and a community of practice that fosters key analytics and theoretical advances to examine and understand the causes and outcomes of water insecurity, focusing at the household scale. So my own research examines dimensions of unjust and inequitable water systems and institutions with an eye towards the causes of insecurity from a political economic perspective. We'd also like to acknowledge that much of our work has come out of the contributions of our colleagues in the RCN and HWISE. And also for our members in the audience who would like to learn more about HWISE, you can certainly visit us at hwise-rcn.org. And there are several ways in which you can join in and learn more about what we're doing. This episode is really part of a larger collaboration with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the Feed the Future USAID Innovation Lab on small scale irrigation to think about and revalue multiple use water services for food and water security. So we will be recording this event and hosting it on our HWISE YouTube channel. So after the talk tomorrow, you should be able to see this, and we will also be promoting it on our social media. Now, our format is designed to be an informal discussion, and there's not a large audience, and there'll be certainly some rotating in. So if you have questions, please feel free. We want to encourage a conversation. Type those in the chat box, and I will do my best to engage everyone in the conversation. So after an hour, we'll stop our recording, but of course, if panelists can say a little bit, are there more questions, we certainly can have a conversation roll over, but we do focus our time on that hour. So now to introduce our fabulous discussants, I'd like each one of them to introduce themselves, tell us about who you are, kind of where you work, and a brief overview of what you've been working on in water and water security. So I'm going to turn it over to Steph Smith as the first person. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And first of all, also for the invitation. We call ourselves a think and do tank in the field of water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. That is, we do research, thought leadership work around that, but also in some of the countries where we work, we try and strengthen the sector. In that, we take what we call a systems approach, really looking at what are the underlying systems that make the provision of water, sanitation, and hygiene services last. And in that, we also look at the intersections between the WASH sector, the water and sanitation hygiene sector, and other sectors. And one of these is the intersection with the provision of water for agriculture, water resources management, which has given rise to the work that we have been doing on multiple use services. I must say, over the past years, I've done less on that topic, though recently I happened to do a small assignment on that in Mozambique. The rest of my current work really looks into mostly, I would say, the costing and financing of water and sanitation services, both at sector level, but also at more systems level, Yeah, how do we make sure that that water services are financed in a sustainable manner, and what are the systems needed for that? Thank you. Over to the next panel member.
Thank you, Steph. Really appreciate the overview. I'm going to turn it over to Matt for a brief introduction.
Sure. Thank you, Wendy, for allowing me to join this panel. And so Matt Stellbauer here. I am the Associate Program Director of the Innovation Lab for Small Scale Irrigation here at Texas A&M University. Together with Dr. Lefore, who's the other panelist, our lab, and well, in a consortium of research institutions. Our lab investigates how to feasibly, sustainably expand small-scale irrigation. And to do that, our starting points include activities like mapping the adoption of potential small-scale irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa, but also Southeast Asia. We also work with private sector companies to develop innovative business models for achieving more sustainable resource use through small-scale irrigation. We do some work on irrigated livestock fodder. We work with a couple of research institutions to look at finance options for small-scale irrigation, and then we also dabble a little bit in improving women's access to irrigation. In addition to my lab duties, I'm also a PhD student studying under Dr. Jepson. My research primarily looks at the influence of multiple-use water services on the household water security of people in rural and peri-urban areas globally. Currently, I'm conducting a study in northern Ghana where I'm investigating the relationship between multiple-use water services and inter-household water sharing. Also wrapping up a paper on the influence of multiple-use water services on household water security of irrigating households in two regions of Mali. And so that's a brief overview, and that's kind of what I'm up to. So.
Great, thank you, Matt. And then finally, I'd like to hand it over to Nicola Fournier.
Hi, thank you, Wendy. I'm really happy to be able to join today. I won't be seen today because I'm sitting at the airport in Tallahassee and not able to work my camera, but I'm with you here. So I'm currently the director of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Small Scale Irrigation, which Matt has already mentioned. We are leading this from the Borlaug Institute at Texas A&M University. As Matt already mentioned, as a program, I mean, we really research, the linkages between small scale irrigation and many other topics: nutrition, gender, economics, energy, water resource sustainability risks, and all of this set within the changing climate, of course. And we work with a consortium of both research and private sector partners. Some of that research does touch on aspects of multiple use because of those interlinkages and the crosses. My own research is primarily on water and natural resource governance, conflict over resources. I also work on gender and innovative finance mechanisms. Most of my work has focused in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was formerly with the CGIAR and the International Water Management Institute, where we also worked on multiple use. And so today I'll try to bring a perspective to multiple use from an irrigation point of view.
Excellent.
Over.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think what is exciting about this panel is that we have experts from the drinking water sector and the irrigation sector, and the tensions between the kinds of multiple use systems that are out there. And that really leads to kind of my next question. And I think first off, the audience may be not fully familiar with multiple use water services. How does it operate? The forms that it takes in terms of rural and urban context. And so I want to just do a sort of a round robin with our panelists to start off. If they can sort of briefly describe kind of how you're thinking about multiple use services, and maybe an example and sharing an example or experience that you've had in a project implementation or research that you're working on currently or in the past. And I think hopefully we can flesh out for the audience this phenomena that is actually kind of quite complex in its variations. So I'm going to hand it off. We're going to do a round robin. I'll start with Matt. If you could begin that part of the conversation.
Sure, thank you. So, to begin, I think, you need to make it clear that, when we think about multiple uses or multiple use water services, that multiple uses of water and multiple use water service systems are two different but complementary things. When you speak about multiple uses of water, you're speaking about the ways in which rural communities, which are oftentimes not connected to water services, are supplying their own water from ground and surface water sources, to conduct a range of livelihood activities, whether it's, washing, cooking, brick making, feeding livestock, what have you. And then, when you talk about multiple use water services, MUS is a model for water service delivery that complements and largely accelerates people's multiple water uses. And so this service model often brings clean water closer to people's homes, opening pathways for investments in water security, nutrition, and human health. And so, there are multiple ways that that multiple use water services present themselves. There's a model called Irrigation Plus, where priorities for water use are centered around irrigation, but you may add washing steps at an irrigation canal to make it easier for people to conduct those domestic activities. Conversely, there's Domestic Plus, where your priorities for water use are centered around domestic activities, and so you're adding implements to a system to make it easier for people to do things like household gardens, or conduct productive activities using a system designed for domestic use. So.
Excellent, thank you. And Nicole, with your work in irrigation, what are your how do you understand it? And then what are some of the examples perhaps, or ways you think about multiple-use water services in the context of irrigation?
Yeah, so I mean, as Matt has already described, I mean, really the multiple uses de facto, it's very common. It's really about how people, particularly in rural areas, cope with water insecurity. And so it's really spreading their risks related to water across multiple sources and for multiple uses. And when you introduce irrigation, it complicates the relationships around water, because now you oftentimes have public agencies involved. You have publicly supported or publicly funded sources of water that have higher regulations, and especially with irrigation water, where there are restrictions and sometimes fines or penalties for using water out of irrigation systems for domestic purposes. So for example, we worked in a small irrigation system developed by farmers in Malawi, where we really saw that even though the public system had tried to develop sources for drinking water so that people wouldn't take water out of the canals or out of the system for drinking, people were still bringing their laundry to wash in the irrigation system. And it was common practice to bring animals and livestock for watering, which then of course trampled on, the irrigated fields. And so it really does complicate relationships, because it introduces new actors and it introduces new activities. For some time, there had been a little bit of a decline in focus on multiple use services, and really trying to focus more on developing sources through public support and through donor support for all the different uses. But really with COVID, climate change, as well as in some of the countries we're working where we have political conflict, we're really seeing that there's kind of a shift in attention back to multiple use services, because during COVID and during some of these conflicts, the households that had water supply, particularly for irrigations, that had been developed for irrigation, not only were they able to get their own water supply more secure, but they were also able to support neighboring households. And that also enabled them, and continues to enable them, to have less disruption and a smoother process through drought, through localized conflict, and through the times of COVID where mobility was restricted. So we are seeing a little bit of a shift back to attention to understanding how to better intentionally develop multiple use services. Over.
Excellent, thank you. And then I'm going to hand it over to Stef to talk about his perspectives, I think from the sort of the WASH sector.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the two previous speakers, I think, have already summarized it very well. Huh? Multiple use of water is the practice, whereas multiple use services is the intentional approach of trying to meet the multiple needs that people have by developing the infrastructure, but also the corresponding service delivery arrangements to make that possible. And often you find a kind of a hybrid where on the one hand you have services that are developed, like an irrigation canal or a domestic water supply, that to some extent meet these services, but next to that you find also the practices, the self-supply practices, if and when these services are insufficient or only meet these demands partially. I think what you described, what Nicole described in her example, we have seen that also a lot, where households draw on the public water supply system for their domestic needs, as well as some small-scale productive use around the homestead, like a backyard garden, a few chickens. And in addition, they may have their private irrigation well or draw on another public or communal irrigation scheme. So you get all kind of hybrids in there. And I think what we have found useful in that is to think about two additional elements to that. First of all is the site of use and the scale at which multiple use happens. And when we think about sites, first site is the homestead. You may have multiple use of water at the homestead, and what I mentioned already, next to the domestic uses which typically take place at the homestead. You also have the chickens, a brick making, a small backyard garden. A second is communal water points. I think what we find in, for example, Southern Africa, very common communal water points where people fetch water for domestic uses, but where a cattle trough or another cattle drinking place is added where people can take their cattle to. And then a third place is what we and that's maybe coming from a domestic perspective, have called the distant fields, that are outside the village or on the outskirts of the village, where irrigated agriculture may take place at typically larger scale. And again, at these distant fields, different types of multiple use take place. A second element to that is then the different livelihoods patterns within a community, because that is what we found important, for example, in our research in Honduras, in Central America, but also in Southern Africa, is that livelihood patterns vary a lot within a community and hence have different water needs and hence very different multiple use practices and needs. A large scale farmer has multiple use needs. He or she needs water for drinking at the farm, but also needs it for maybe large herds of cattle or larger irrigated fields. But typically a large scale farmer, what we found, for example, in Honduras, they can cater for themselves. They have a private well. The uses are very different from a rural dweller who may not even have a plot of land. Sometimes what we found in Honduras, they don't have any multiple water needs at all because they lack other assets to make use of that. And probably for this discussion, the most interesting livelihood groups are the smallholder farmers who may have multiple use at these different sites, at and around the homestead, at communal water points, and at the field scale. So it's really that diversity of livelihoods that make that more complicated, and particularly to do so in an equitable manner. How can you provide then multiple use services that take into account these needs, but also do so in an equitable manner where where those who can afford it for themselves do so, but where particularly smaller, poorer farmers or families are helped, but also taking into account the needs of those who might only need domestic water, like rural dwellers or farm workers.
Thank you. At this point, I'm going to open it up. Are there questions from our audience for our panelists on anything that's been said? And then I'll move to the next question. I actually have a comment too, but I'll just keep that opening there. If the guests want to ask a question, just put in the chat and we'll circle back to that as well. So again, we want to keep this lively. So I mean, what I'm hearing is that the persistence of practice around multiple use services and the ways in which these are the activities of securing water that people do, that it sort of has gone in and out of the policy frame. And Nicole, you mentioned how COVID, climate change, and conflict have collectively put a spotlight on these practices as potentially being able to increase resilience, for example, in the communities you're working in. But at the same time, I'm also hearing still issues around barriers. So one other point that you brought up, Nicole, which maybe we can probe a little more, is the role of the state. And particularly, I was curious about how you reported that there is this sort of punitive role, that the state's role is not about just simply financing and governing, but enforcing existing frameworks on what kind of water does what sort of work. So when we think forward about, potentially revaluing MUS in this moment of this opening, because of perhaps the collective view that these systems can support household water security and other co-benefits, we can talk about those in a second. It seems as though there are institutional structures that are still quite unchanged. And so whatever technology or whatever sort of investment that might be proposed in the future, and we'll talk about policy later, that could enhance these practices, to what extent do you think there needs to be some sort of institutional change? And then if that's the case, where is that located? Is it a national policy? Is it local communities? Is it the institution? So that's sort of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, no, and I understand what you're getting at, and it's a really important point. And I think that one of the reasons why the public agencies come in from this perspective of regulation is that they're trying to reduce the risks that they know may occur as people are trying to cope themselves. So, they can observe that there is increased micro conflicts because there's competing uses for water, between livestock keepers and settled farmers and women that are trying to use the water for domestic uses. And also recognizing the risks to households and communities from potential water pollution that comes from the irrigation development, because it tends to be associated with increased fertilizer use and increased agrochemical use. So really, I think the public agencies come in from a regulatory point of view, first from infrastructure and protecting the infrastructure from damage of livestock and damage that is associated with domestic uses as people are climbing over canals and diverting water, but also from that public safety, that public safety and security point of view. So that is the perspective that has always come in more from the public agency side. And part of that is because they're not designed intentionally as multiple use. They're designed as single use. So what you're trying to do then is you're trying to enforce single use. And doing that, yes, from a very punitive point of view. And sometimes they do transfer that responsibility for regulation and punishment, essentially, like fines or whatever it might be, to the local community or to a water users association. But those water users associations, these are communities, and they do tend to find it difficult to impose fines on their neighbors. And, you know, I think there's also a perceived risk that if at some point they need the water for other uses, you know, they don't want to punish others and then themselves be subjected to that same punishment at some point. So I think a lot of the source of the issue here is that the design from a public point of view is very technological. It's very single-use focused. And so the shift really needs to be thinking about multiple use as an intentional design that takes into consideration the cross sectors, that also takes into consideration the multiple uses, and whether that's thinking about it from a kind of socio-technical bundling that could come through policy and institutional reform. You know, there's multiple angles that could come in from that could start to address this singular use approach and the tendency to regulate as opposed to design for those multiple uses. Over.
Other comments from our panelists? Steph, go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree with the analysis that that Nicole just shared, and in some of our work that we did with IWMI, the International Water Management Institute, and also a publication we developed about that, we identified 3 possible, let's say, ways out of that institutional conundrum, because it's one thing to recognize that single-use mindset of institutions. The other is what could be done about it. And I think the first one is to recognize that one integrated institution that does all water development and all water service delivery doesn't exist and probably will not exist, and like an overarching integrated institution. So we also, because there is some merit in the sectoral specialization and focus and so on. So we see 3 institutional ways forward. The first of all is one whereby the sectoral institutions do what they do and a little bit more, whereby the domestic water supply agencies provide a bit more water, allow certain level of multiple use to happen, and I think in a way that has helped a lot with the SDG agenda, which provides lots of emphasis on providing higher levels of services, more water closer to the homestead. That in itself enables already quite a bit of multiple use. Likewise, we know irrigation agencies can do very simple things like making steps so that you can easily access the canal, or having small water kettle drinking points. Doesn't require lots of money, doesn't require complex planning, can be done relatively easily. A second way of overcoming the institutional limitations is coordination between, let's say, domestic service providers, utilities, and irrigation agencies, coordination between those. That can also be done. We also know coordination comes with lots of meetings and transaction costs, and in our experience tends to focus then more on the formal side of water service provision, where you get situations that are common also in developed countries, in France, in Portugal, where utilities, domestic water supply utilities, take water from a canal, from an irrigation canal. The irrigation agency provides the water in bulk, and agreements are being made for that. That typically does not meet the needs of the more informal sector, but it's at least one part of the puzzle. And the third one where we do see what we see as an entry point is where local governments, whether it's district, municipalities, counties, whatever the name of the local government, have that kind of an integrated role. I think IWMI and others have done interesting work on that in South Africa, where local government, as part of their integrated development planning or integrated planning, whatever the name is, try and then see how you can align irrigation development with domestic water supply development, with agriculture, livestock, and so on. So these we see as 3 kind of ways of breaking out of these institutional silos.
Nicole, you have a response, follow up.
Yeah. I did want to mention also that as irrigation development becomes much more individual household level, where households and farmers are investing in their own water sources, it does add yet another layer of complexity, because then you're trying to find ways of integrating and bundling messaging with even more actors, because then the irrigation agencies are no longer involved. And you're working either with borehole drillers or pump suppliers, and so it does add yet another layer of complexity. And I mean, a lot of people talk about that as it being informal irrigation development. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right approach, but it definitely pushes it outside of the public sector, and it means that you also have to begin engaging with these private sector actors in order to reach the kinds of development goals associated with water access.
Yeah, and that's something I've been thinking a lot about too, because what has been brought up in the conversation is that the role of the state and some of the there's institutional ossification for sort of political reasons, but from a purely regulatory standpoint, it's been about risk mitigation. And one of the major risk issues, and that was identified earlier, and one thing I've been thinking a lot about, and it's not necessarily in the domestic plus space, but in the irrigation plus space, is the water quality and the concerns around water quality for human or even animal consumption. And that historically has been a challenge that has never, I mean, we do have household water treatment, but to varying degrees of success, but ultimately water quality management has always been at a state level. So you have these two forces, one which Nicole's in the ILC has been working on, which is the farmer-led irrigation, which is a decentralization of irrigation. But yet at the same time, the key problem in irrigation for MUS is water quality, which historically has been a centralized problem that institutions have tried to address. So it makes me think about kind of next round around multiple uses that, and are there potential existing technologies that can be decentralized in a similar manner? And I don't have the answer to it. It's just something that in this conversation dovetails with things I've been thinking about as the landscape of water centralization, decentralization changes. And as you mentioned, irrigation becomes more decentralized in this case. So I wonder what your thoughts are about the particular challenges of these different systems. So irrigation has the challenge of water quality, domestic plus in terms of challenges, and I'm going to look to Steph to make sure that I don't sort of get it wrong, but it also seems to be one around volume and around kind of like how do you move that water to these other uses. And so each one of these MUS systems are very different in this way. And so again, thinking through what are the challenges, there's that institutional level, but it's also paired to an actual biophysical challenge, at least in the context of the water quality. So it's certainly something I've been thinking about and curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, good questions. So what additional risks do we see by particularly where further irrigation development decentralizes, and where you're basically talking about private farmers who have their own well and so on? In the one hand, I think that could present potentially a risk, because a common technology for that are wells, shallow wells, whatever, deep wells that are used for multiple uses. At the same time, what we see in the WASH sector, in the domestic, is that these kind of wells are more and more phased out. With the adoption of the SDGs, there has been a strong push for what are called safely managed services, which by definition means water is available on premise, comes from an improved source. And by having water on premise, typically consumption levels go up. It's typical, and so you could almost argue it's a problem that it's solving itself, where people get connected to piped water supplies over the and in a way it is helped a lot by solar, so the introduction of solar technologies, where people are moving rapidly away from hand pumps to solar. With solar you can pump much more than with a hand pump. It's easier to make small networks. Obviously, that is the larger trend. It does still mean that there are, all in all, still lots of people who use unprotected wells that are developed, let's say, or are being developed for irrigation, also for domestic uses. But those, at least from a domestic sector, are also seen as the kind of the informal, unimproved kind of things. So, but in a way, it's interesting that the irrigation sector is going more from larger public irrigation schemes to more decentralized, farmer-owned, small community-owned, whereas in the domestic water supply sector, we see the opposite. We see the trend towards piped supplies, also a growing role for utilities, so moving away from community managed towards more professional service providers like utilities and the like. So yeah, these seem to be two opposite directions with all kind of implication for Mus.
And in a way, it sort of segues to the question that Nitu asked in the chat. She asks, and Nitu, jump in if you want to add to this. Does multiple water use have adequate relevance in urban areas to have a dedicated policy? So if I'm asking that wrong, Nitu, let me know, but it's about thinking through MUS in urban context. And Steph responded. Steph, do you want to just elaborate a little bit more on what you popped in the chat?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I find it always, ironic or sad that we that in urban areas, at least from a domestic point of view, no one asks how you use the water. As long as you have a connection, you pay for what you consume, and whether you put that water in a swimming pool or you have a beer brewery or a small backyard garden. And of course, once you get into fully commercial water use or industrial water use, that is highly regulated. Those industry owners or small commercial users, they pay for it, and so on. Whereas in rural areas, I remember one village in Honduras, they had a whole internal regulation. They said you can use the domestic water supply for up to 2 pigs, so many square meters of tomato gardens, but you're not allowed to do this, and brick gardening, brick making only with specific permits from the water committee. And so in a way, in the urban areas, it is common, it's accepted, no one even thinks about it, it's highly regulated. But in rural areas, it is less so. Of course, in the informal urban areas, it becomes a different issue again, where you may have, let's say, urban agriculture, maybe drawing from the kind of decentralized irrigation wells that you are describing, where people may then use these own private wells for drinking rather than using the utility provision. So for me, more than an urban rural issue, it's often more one of a formal versus informal issue.
Yeah, and that makes me think about sort of a next, as we've sort of predicated this panel, is sort of there's a next wave, or there's a smaller push to think about MUS, but we're actually in a different context than we were maybe 15 years ago. And I do want to sort of highlight the work of Stef and the collaborators that he's has worked with many years ago on multiple use. But it seems to me from this conversation that the context that you worked in 15, 20 years ago under MUS, it's changed significantly. And so if we were to think about what would a revaluing or a refocus on MUS look like today, what can we learn from the past research, but what new challenges do we need to think about? Now, just to highlight what Nicole's already said around COVID, climate change, and conflict, I think it's a nice alliteration, by the way, Nicole, thank you, I'll remember that. Those three things certainly bring home kind of a more urgency to looking back to MUS, but even then, the work that we know now was in a different context. So again, just to sort of say, or to ask the panelists, what are your thoughts on potential policy interventions or way in which we can make MUS visible? Because it still seems to be invisible to policymakers. I mean, that's why we're talking about it. So how can we make it visible again, but through what ways or through what mechanisms? And is that the pathway for potentially revaluing it within a broader policy or development context? So that was a really big question, but I want to throw it to the panelists and see what their thoughts are on that.
Wendy, I'll come in and just say from our perspective and some of the things that we found. And I do want to return to the issue of water quality and health, because I think health may end up being one of the sectors or entry points really that brings multiple use back onto the agenda and enables us to reconsider how to do it intentionally to get the best outcomes from however a multiple use service program is designed. One of the things that I wanted to highlight was within our innovation lab, IFPRI has done work on looking at links between irrigation and WASH, and really highlighted the fact that there seems to be an assumption that once people have water, their hygiene practices automatically change. So we've removed the water barrier. Now people are just going to improve hygiene practices, but we found that's not necessarily the case. So there is also a health implication from hygiene. So from that kind of WASH sector, you've supplied the water, but you still have the issue of hygiene practices. So that remains a health concern and a health entry point. And of course, as you've already mentioned, is the water quality issue for drinking and domestic uses. And as agricultural intensifies and as agrochemical use increases, we definitely need to see more of an institutional intervention from a health perspective related to water quality. And in some of these contexts where the systems are not necessarily well developed or they are not integrated, there could also be a role here for service provision. So it could be a service provision of water testing. So I do think there's a couple of entry points. One is from the health sector, and the other one is really looking at the big push around entrepreneurship and youth and technology, that kind of tech services that entrepreneurs can do, and looking at it from that point as a potential for youth to become involved in the water sector, but really as small entrepreneurs providing the service around water quality testing. I mean, it's not as simple as that, and I do realize it, but I do think that these are two development goals that could bring multiple use back onto the agenda, and that could give us strong entry points for making a case for it. Over.
Thank you. I want to see if there's follow-up on Nicole, and I have some follow-ups of my own, but I want to hand it over to Steph.
Yeah. So I think in a way, and maybe it sounds odd what I'm going to say, but for me, Mus does not necessarily have to come back on the agenda. And at least talking from a domestic water supply point of view, what I would say is let's pursue the agenda of safely managed services, providing higher levels of services, and use the potential of multiple use as an extra argument of selling that. It's a trend that's happening, and we know in the Jal Jeevan mission in India, where there's the aim to have a tap in every household. Many other countries are rapidly going now towards higher level services, but that comes with a transition. How do we actually make sure that people want a household connection, particularly where that implies a payment? And I think it may be more of a strategy to create the demands for that, rather than selling Mus to domestic water supply agencies, because that would might open up a can of worms. What I do think is important is making sure that where indeed countries, regions, rural areas move to higher levels of services, that then that is not accompanied by the kind of the punitive regulations that we talked about earlier. Right? So that these kind of limitations and prohibitions are not built in. That's a little bit how I would put that policy message forward. But I'd like to also hear, and maybe Matt, you can comment on that, is what would be the policy messages within the irrigation sector, and particularly where future irrigation development will be through a kind of self-supply or farmer household driven irrigation development, because that, I must admit, is a kind of a subsector that I have less insight. And yeah, I'd like to hear as well to see how some of that self-supply agenda can be mixed there.
Okay, Matt.
Sure. Yeah, and thanks. And I do agree with Steph that the MUS doesn't necessarily need to come back on the agenda, but it can complement and be used as an extra argument for improvements in domestic water supply. And I think that I think in terms of the irrigation space, you could look at using the MUS argument to facilitate the things that the farmers are already doing themselves. I mean, if they're already doing farmer-led irrigation, making it easier for them to continue to do that, but also develop your policies in such a way that it accelerates and enables them to better finance those activities, as well as increase the level of quality and productive uses of that water. I think would be an important policy implication there. And
so it seems to me, I mean, and so Steph, I'm gonna not push back really, but just sort of maybe refine kind of what I was thinking, in the sense that it seems the focus on safe supply, safely managed water, the water ladder, as we say, in terms of domestic use, that some of the health outcomes can be achieved. And I think in particular in urban areas, I think that's pretty clear that might be optional. But at the same time, there still will be many contexts in which that ladder just is not going to be there. Like the ladder just doesn't show up, or it's half there. And so one of the things is how can we engage with those communities for which the ladder is broken, or that it's just not going to have the investment. And I speak to that, ironically enough, I speak to that from the perspective of looking at water challenges in the United States, where the assumption is everyone has awesome water and everyone is at the top of the ladder. If you look at the data from, the UN, it's like, oh, the US has enough water, we're all good. But you start to kind of go into those spaces of vulnerability and social exclusion, and that ladder is kind of broken. There's a few of those rings that are kind of falling off, right? And so I think from the domestic side of things, I hear, and I on the one hand, I agree, like I think that's where we have to push it, but at the same time, there's like this world out there in which that's not going to happen. So how potentially MUS has a space or has an opportunity to kind of fill the gaps. So I don't know if that's resignation or just realism. But just wanted to throw that out there, Steph, and just curious what your thoughts are on my commentary.
No, very good, and yeah, no, I with our colleagues from Water for People, we have also been looking into the water supply challenges in the US, and that's pretty shocking in terms of a missing ladder. No, and of course, I think my earlier comment is really the big picture trend. Clearly, there is, and there will, at least for the coming 20 years, be very important segments of the population that are stuck on the lowest level of the ladder and will remain stuck there. And maybe the argument, the point is more, I think within the water sector, we need to have a better segmentation and saying, here is a segment that's in the urban, the more formal type of multiple use that Nico was asking about. Then we have a certain segment where that is climbing that ladder, which has then more implications around how do we regulate those. Then we have a certain segment that is served at the lowest level of the ladder, but with all kind of informal practices happening. What can we do in the meantime to accommodate those? And there is a segment, probably the last 5%, mostly in the most remote, rural, dispersed areas, where for whatever reasons, climbing the ladder, at least through formal service delivery models, is far off, but where self-supply approaches or household water solutions are the way to go. Some of the work we have done in Honduras wasn't necessarily done with a kind of a Mus lens, but was about, okay, how do you literally provide water literally to the few isolated houses on the top of the mountain? And that was done from a domestic use point of view, but I'm 100% sure that those families use those systems also for their backyard garden, also use that for their cattle. It is the kind of family wells that I think of that colleagues of us worked on in Ethiopia, developed by, in the kind of the decentralized irrigation way, developed by individual farmers, use it for the domestic uses. And that is, I don't know, maybe 5%. In other countries, it may be 10, 15%, I would say max. And so maybe what is the key message there is segmenting the population according to the type of water they have, the access, the level of water security they have now for multiple uses, and visiting a bit what will be the trend for the coming 5 to 10 years. And from there, distilling what are both the practical, but also the policy implications for that.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. That was great. And I see we only have 4 minutes left, but I do want to circle back before we wrap up today. And again, this has been a great conversation to kind of Nicole's point. And I guess what I'm also searching for, and maybe it's a futile exercise, but are there potential policy entry points? And you did mention two. One was health, the other was water quality, and on the domestic, or I'm sorry, on the irrigation plus side. And with that, I'm very intrigued by the service provider concept around water quality. It's something I've been thinking about, and there are some really interesting examples, and I want to highlight those of my colleague, Patrick Thompson, who's currently at Oxford, who is involved with the smart pumps in Kenya, and using kind of new technological mechanisms, but also restructuring a service provider model of maintenance on hand pumps, that he was trying to make the connection between improving service quality to improve health outcomes. And that's an example around reducing the number of days that the pumps were out of commission, for example, in rural Kenya. And that if you reduce the number of days, you actually potentially mitigate exposure to poor quality water and other sources that are not clean. So that's a service model, but it seems to me that might be an interesting analogy, or a sort of an analogous mechanism to think about. It may not be around the supply of water, the mechanism of water, but water quality itself, and in an analogous service provider framework. So Nicole, I just threw this at you. I did not tell you this question ahead of time, but if you are willing to respond to that idea, what are your thoughts? If not, you can totally punt it.
Well, I mean, we do see a number of service provision models coming out on the irrigation side, particularly because this is farmer-led, it is, dispersed, and it does link to the introduction of various types of pumps. So in some cases, they're taking pumps around and, giving people access to pumps for a certain number of hours or days. And so is a lot of different service provision models that are emerging. And that is also why I threw it out there too, without giving it a whole lot of thought. But, we see that the water quality emphasis in many of the countries where we work in sub-Saharan Africa, but also, in Central Asia, places like Uzbekistan, where water quality has been more from an industrial side of industrial point of view or a mining point of view. And really irrigation hasn't been part of that discussion around water quality. So just thinking about the unlikelihood of being able to develop those institutions quick enough to address the rapid increase in agrochemicals and other forms of polluted sources of water. It may be short term, but it could be a potential a bridging mechanism until institutions are able to address water quality at a larger scale.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I warned the panelists that the hour would go by fast, and it certainly has. We have 1 minute left. So I want to thank Nicole, Matt, and Steph for their time. I want to thank the audience. As I said, this will be posted online, and we'll send the panelists the link. It'll be on our YouTube channel, which has our library of other episodes that are really, again, trying to get at the intersectional challenges around water insecurity and other, whether it's childhood health, whether it's drinking water quality across different disciplines. And last week we had child health and water insecurity, and to let everyone know, next week in 10 days, 17th of November, we are going to have another HWISE-NOW on convergence research and water security, moderated by Dr. Amber Wooditch from Arizona State. And more details on that will be on our website and our events page. But again, I really am grateful for your time and your insight and your expertise as we move forward. And again, as I mentioned, this is part of a larger collaboration with the UNFAO, and hopefully these kinds of conversations will help target our thoughts around revaluing multiple use water services for development. So with that, I want to thank everyone, and I wish you the best for the rest of your week. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks to the other panelists for including me. It's been a great discussion. Hopefully we can have some more discussions.
Yo,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Thank you, Steph. We'll be in touch. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. You all have a great week. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.